So, starting off, it says solve x squared plus 1 equals 0 under the real number system. So what would we do to solve this problem?
I don't know.
We'd subtract 1. That gives us x squared equals negative 1.
It's I.
And then we would do what? We'd take the square root of x squared. And what is the square root of x squared?
X.
Equals, but if you square root one side, you have to square root the other side. Now, we're going to learn more about this later, but if you square root, you get plus or minus.
Plus.
And what is the square root of negative 1? What number multiplied by itself is
I.
negative 1?
I.
There's no solution.
Zero.
There's no solution. So what we would say is there's no solution. It says to solve it under the real number system. So we can't use imaginary numbers. So if you were in 8th grade and you solved this problem, you would just say no solution. It doesn't work. Okay? So it says here, the complex number system, over 400 years ago, mathematicians proposed the imaginary number I to solve the above problem, as which I squared equals negative 1. People couldn't imagine such a concept. Mathematicians called it imaginary because it obviously couldn't exist. Today, mathematicians and scientists use the imaginary unit in electrical engineering and the study of vectors. So I just want to really quickly teach you a few things. What?
What's a vector?
It's a directional. It's like a directional.
Also, Billy.
It has. So if you see it in like in science, a vector looks like this. Oops, I should put an arrow on it. And it's a line that measures both direction and distance. So it's something in this direction of that distance. Is how it goes.
Okay, so you can't have imaginary numbers like sine equations, right?
Okay, so starting off, you need to know these. This is called the cycle of I cycles, okay? So I is the square root of negative 1. What? I is the square root of negative 1. But ultimately, if you ever see the square root of negative 1, you're going to call it I. So know that the square root of negative 1 is I. What? So, for example, let's say I have the square root of negative 4. What's the square root of negative 4?
I.
Negative 2 times negative 2 is not negative 4.
I.
So really, what this is, if we use our multiplication property, this is really the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4, right? Kind of like we talked about last class, the square root of 2 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 6, right? Because 2 times 3 is 6. So the square root of 4 is actually the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4. And we just learned that the square root of negative 1 is I, and what's the square root of 4?
2.
It's 2. So we would call this 2I.
Oh.
Okay? I squared is actually negative 1. I told you to take a mental screenshot during that little picture. Remember, I times I equals negative 1. That's that thing that solved our problem. Mathematicians are like, hey, there's no number that I can multiply it by itself and it gives me a negative number. So they came up with the number I. So I times I is negative 1. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because what is I?
Letter.
Well, it's the square root of negative 1. So if I take that and I square it, what's the square root of a square? The number underneath, the radicand. Okay? So, and then the last one, well, I cubed is really I times I squared, right? So what was I? I is I.
I square root of negative 1.
I squared is
I squared of I.
negative 1. So I cubed is negative I.
Does I always equal negative 1?
I doesn't equal negative 1. I squared equals negative 1.
So the square root of
The square root of negative 1 is I. And then lastly, I to the fourth is really just
I squared.
I squared times I squared again, right?
So it's positive 1.
And what was I squared?
Negative 1.
So negative 1 times negative 1 is actually
Positive.
1. 15. So the ones you need to remember, I'm going to circle them. I is I. I is I. It's the square root of negative 1. I squared is actually negative 1. So an imaginary number times an imaginary number is actually a real number. So it's kind of like a negative times a negative is a positive. An imaginary times an imaginary is real. It works the same way. I cubed is negative I, and I to the fourth is 1. You need to remember those 4 things. You have to have them memorized. It's called the cycle of I. Because if you know those 4 things, you can literally simplify anything. Now, what's the easiest of these 4? What's the easiest one to remember?
I.
Equals I.
What is I to the fourth?
1.
1. I'd say that's probably the easiest to remember.
Well, I is
So,
I.
and I is I.
I is I.
When we look at this, okay, so we're going to do just a couple examples here. I to the 12th is really, I would write this out with me just so you have this example. It's going to feel redundant, but here we go. I times I times I.
12 times.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I'm losing track.
11, 12.
12.
Wait, what?
I to the 12th is I times I times I times I, right? 12 times.
So it's 3. There's only 11 then, so
Is there?
I think so. 2, 4,
No, it's 12.
8, 10, 11.
A few extra multiplication things. Now, the reason I told you I to the fourth is not only probably the easiest to remember, but it's the easiest to do. Because what is I times I times I times I?
1.
1. Times what is I times I times I times I?
1.
1. Times I times I times I times I.
Another 1.
What's 1 times 1 times 1?
Oh, it's 1.
I to the 12th power is 1.
Why can't you just put
I said write this out just so you remember. That's what notes are for, to write it in the way that you remember. But yes, and a shortcut, if the exponent is divisible by 4, what is your answer? 1. So what is I to the 16th?
1.
What is I to the 24th?
1.
What is
1.
I to the 64th?
1.
1. Anything that's divisible by 4 will always be 1. Okay?
So for this next one, would it be negative 1 every time?
Okay, let's check. So this is our last one for today. Hang in there with me. I to the 18th is really, I'm not going to write it out again.
We just said
But-
to the 16th was.
What is the next smallest number that's divisible by 4 from 18?
2. 3.
4?
5.
16.
My bad.
Times I squared, right?
Yeah, so it'd be 1.
I to the
times negative
16th times I squared is I to the 18th. So we agree with that?
1. Negative 1.
But I to the 16th is actually 1. And now this is the reason why you need to remember those 4 cycles of I, because you should know what I squared is.
Negative 1.
It's negative 1. So break it into 4s first. Break it into a number, the largest number that's divisible by 4, and then basically your leftover is your answer. What is I squared?
Negative 1.
Negative 1. And 1 times
Oh,
negative 1 is
But you
negative
know the answer to 3?
1. What is it?
It's negative 5.
Correct. How did you get that? The next smallest number from 23 that's divisible by 4 is 20, right?
20
20 divided by 4 is 5. Times I to the third.
is negative 5.
So I always break it apart into the first number that's divisible by 4 and then the leftovers. Does that make sense?
I like that.
I like leftovers too. What is I to the 20th power? 1 times I to the third. Look at your cycle of I is negative I. 1 times negative I is negative I.
That's crazy.
All right, that is all for today.
So,